Persuasion the worst Jane Austen adaptation ever? The 2020s seem to have developed quite a fascination for the Regency period, as proven by the worldwide popularity of Netflix's Bridgerton. And Hollywood's latest Jane Austen adaptation clearly intended to ride this wave of public interest. The third adaptation of 1818's Persuasion, the film stars Dakota Johnson in the lead role of Anne Elliot, with Cosmo Jarvis as her romantic interest, Frederick Wentworth. Regency meets rom-com, the film was marketed by Netflix as a, quote, modern, witty approach to the classic novel. But did it succeed? In today's video, I'll be discussing what I did and didn't like about 2022's Persuasion, as well as how it compares to the novel and the adaptations that came before it. I'll also be throwing in some background information on the Regency period and discuss the lasting legacy of Jane Austen. Obviously, there will be spoilers, so don't say I didn't warn you. Now, let's get into it. During her lifetime, Jane Austen's novels brought her little notoriety, as like most female authors of the time period, she published her work anonymously as the desire for fame was seen as a masculine attribute and threatened one's social reputation. Although these works were well received, they had a relatively small audience made up of the educated elite, and it wouldn't be until 1869, 50 years after her death, that she would see a true bout of popularity. Following the release of A Memoir of Jane Austen, which was written by her nephew, interest in her work was reinvigorated and her critical standing was increased. And by the start of the 20th century, she had become one of the most famous British writers in history. It was around this time that fans of Austen's work, who had become interested in her before she became mainstream, began to distinguish themselves from those who didn't truly understand her novels. These literary hipsters referred to themselves as Janeites, and continue to dictate conversations about the meaning of her work to this day. As one of the most celebrated authors in history, her work has been adapted for the stage and screen on numerous occasions, with the first spike of modern-day Austen-related content beginning in the 1970s, with the BBC releasing an assortment of adaptations throughout the decade. While these films are credited for reintroducing a generation of Brits to Austen's work, the first true wave of worldwide Austen mania began in the 1990s, with a boom of adaptations catapulting Austen to mainstream attention. In 1995 alone, we saw the cinematic releases of Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, and Clueless, alongside the BBC-produced television series of Pride and Prejudice. The commercial and critical success of these adaptations is often attributed to two major movie trends of the 90s. First, the popularity of costume dramas. Second, the rise of the rom-com. The secret to Jane Austen's modern success lies in the timeless quality of her novels, having universal themes that are just as relevant today as they were 200 years ago, as well as characters who could be seamlessly translated into any era. This is why modern reimaginings of her novels, like Clueless, Bridget Jones's Diary, and Pride and Prejudice, were able to succeed with fans and outsiders alike, and their popularity prompted other updated retellings of classic literature. A key element of the demand for Jane Austen adaptations during this period was that these films were deliberately made for and aimed at women, but without coming across as condescending, something that was only achieved because at their very core, these stories were first and foremost written by a woman. While she reigned supreme over the box office in the 90s and early 2000s, like any trend, the oversaturation of Austen's work resulted in people developing a distaste for them, and by the 2010s they were hard to come by. In 2016, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and Love and Friendship were released, but both failed to find a larger audience and reinvigorate public interest in the genre. However, only 6 years later, we're seeing the beginnings of another wave of Austen mania, which is considered to have begun with 2020's Emma, and continued on with 2022's Fire Island, and most recently, Persuasion. For those who are unfamiliar with Persuasion, the protagonist of the story is Anne Elliot, who is approaching spinsterhood, being 27 years of age yet unmarried, and as such she finds herself in a hopeless situation where she's left to care for her ungrateful family. Anne's elder sister, Elizabeth, is vain and desperate for attention, and although unmarried as well, as their father's favorite, she isn't belittled for it the way that Anne is. Her younger sister, Mary, is self-absorbed and dramatic, with a victim complex that leads her to put on airs and exaggerate. Her father, Sir Walter Elliot, is pompous and arrogant, and his lavish spending has resulted in the family falling on hard times. As the overlooked middle child, Anne has developed into an introvert and shies away from conflict, which results in the character attempting to please others even if it's detrimental to her own happiness. This is epitomized through her relationship with Frederick Wentworth, whose proposal several years earlier she was persuaded to decline by her family and friends due to his lack of rank and fortune. Anne's monotonous existence is thrown into disarray when Wentworth reappears years later, having found success in the Royal Navy. This results in Anne reevaluating her situation, lamenting what could have been, struggling to come to terms with her own complacency, and fighting between the past and the future. This leads us to the crux of the novel, which is Anne's journey of self-acceptance, where she's able to eventually reclaim the narrative and find happiness once again. Like much of Austen's work, Persuasion ends on a positive note, with Anne and Wentworth making their feelings known and reuniting, detailing the importance of second chances and the complex nature of love. But prior to that point, it's riddled with sentimentality and restraint. The overall tone of the novel is exemplified by one of its best-known quotes, "I am half agony, half hope," which highlights the various characters' inner turmoil and frustrations, as well as the novel's transition from pessimistic to optimistic. Like all of Jane Austen's novels, Persuasion takes place during the Regency period, which is officially defined as the period of time in Britain between 1811 and 1820, when George IV acted as regent. But nowadays the term is often used to refer to the broader late Georgian era between 1795 and 1837. The film chooses to remain in this time period, but makes certain anachronistic adjustments to the dialogue and characters in an attempt to appeal to contemporary audiences who may not be familiar with the source material. While a few of these changes can be seen as positive improvements, the vast majority are negative, resulting in a film that is Persuasion in name alone. Before I get into what I disliked about the film, I first and foremost want to say that I am not a purist and I do not think adaptations need to follow their source material to a T. After all, I was a fan of 2012's Anna Karenina and 2013's The Great Gatsby. Anachronistic choices can be incredibly beneficial if utilized properly. Take for instance the use of modern music in 2006's Marie Antoinette, or the change in time period for 1996's Romeo and Juliet. But if these changes are included just for the hell of it, then what's the point? An adaptation should set out to capture the essence of the story and the heart of its characters, while translating and modifying it in a way that allows viewers to engage with the story in a new way. Which is why modernized adaptations of Jane Austen's work like Clueless, Bridget Jones's Diary, and Fire Island have proven so successful. It's immediately apparent that no one working on Persuasion understood it, completely misrepresenting multiple aspects of the novel, which is a great disservice to the audience as it implies that they aren't intelligent enough to appreciate Persuasion for what it is. The most obvious dissimilarity between the film and the novel is its tone, with the film coming across as a light-hearted romantic comedy, directly contradicting the melancholic story it's adapting. Having written the novel near the end of her life, when she was ailing and living in poverty, Jane Austen's dire circumstances heavily influenced the direction of her final story, resulting in a more complicated romantic relationship and an older, discontent female protagonist. Much of her work was metaphorical for her own viewpoints and situations, with Austen sharing many of the traits she gave to her non-traditional protagonists, and they were often placed in similar situations that she found herself in. Notably, many of her heroines eventually received a happy ending where they were married to a man who was so in love with them that they cared little about her wealth, status, or family. An idyllic life that the single and struggling Austen may have wished for. The film's difference in tone is first achieved through the anachronistic dialogue, which is significantly more modern than the film's 1800 setting.
Sometimes I have this dream that a giant octopus is sucking my face.
It is often said if you're 5 in London, you're 10 in Bath.
And how would you dance to Beethoven?
Alone in my room with a bottle of red. That's not going to happen.
Because?
Because he's a 10. I never trust a 10. The playlist he made me.
According to director Carrie Cracknell, quote, "The idea with the modernization of the language was to make the psychology of the characters a bit more accessible for a younger audience and a new audience to Jane Austen. The book is a beautiful but quite formal novel. We were looking at ways to open that out and draw in a new group of people to the story." While this isn't necessarily a bad sentiment, in some ways it feels patronizing, as it assumes that younger audiences wouldn't be able to understand something that isn't filtered through Urban Dictionary. Because the majority of the language in the film is at least somewhat accurate to the times, these modern moments are quite jarring, and these lines never manage to reach a point of effortlessness that makes them believable. In most instances, this modern dialogue is completely fabricated, taking no inspiration from Jane Austen's prose. But there are some instances where that is the case, and it's in those moments that you have to wonder why. In the novel, Austen writes, quote, "Now they were as strangers, nay, worse than strangers, for they could never become acquainted. It was a perpetual estrangement," which is far more poignant than,
Now we're strangers. Worse than strangers. We're exes.
Not only do you lose some of the subtleties of Anne's feelings towards Wentworth, but it also reduces their painful separation to that of an ordinary breakup. Imagine if instead of Mr. Darcy saying,
"You have bewitched me, body and soul, and I love, and love, and love you, and never wish to be parted from you from this day on,"
he just told Lizzie, "I'm obsessed with you." It wouldn't hit the same. If your film takes place during a period of time when Austen's words could be believably said by the characters, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? Why give yourself more work just to write something that isn't as good? What's especially odd about this frequent use of modern language is that it doesn't serve any purpose thematically besides garnering easy laughs, and these lines are only funny because they're so out of place, leaving the audience chuckling at their absurdity. If Anne was the only character in the film who spoke in this manner, and only did so when speaking directly to the audience, then it would solidify that these moments existed inside of the character's mind and were fully outside of the realm of reality. But by having every character use this modern language, this anachronism loses all significant meaning and only serves to dumb down Jane Austen's writing. The film is immediately unlike any other Austen adaptation that came before it, as the title character regularly breaks the fourth wall, making jokes directly to the audience and giving silly glances at the camera that go unnoticed by those around her. It's this choice that have led many viewers to refer to it as Fleabag meets Jane Austen, but where Fleabag excels in using this technique to further the story and highlight the lead character's inner emotions, in Persuasion it's an obvious gimmick that does nothing to help the audience understand the character. Not to mention that in the case of Fleabag, these fourth wall breaks create intimacy with the audience that allows us to empathize with the troubled character.
No one's asked me a question in 45 minutes.
So what do you do? Where did you just go?
What?
You just went somewhere. There. Where'd you just go?
While in the case of Persuasion, these two frequent moments only succeed at making Anne Elliot unlikable.
One's family is only escapable by two things: marriage and death. Both seem unlikely in the immediate future.
I had a similar issue with the use of this technique in 2020's Enola Holmes, but at least in the context of that film, it made sense for the character, considering she's young and mischievous. But Anne Elliot is neither of those things. Now, obviously, Fleabag did not invent characters directly addressing the camera, with 1986's Ferris Bueller's Day Off and 2013's The Wolf of Wall Street utilizing the same technique. But it's in the eye rolls and self-deprecating quips that it's obvious where Persuasion's inspiration came from, resulting in a poor imitation of a much cleverer piece of work. This style of narration is very tongue-in-cheek, having an obvious type of humor that isn't fitting for Persuasion, as it's one of Austen's slowest, subtlest, and saddest novels. Because much of the novel is introspective, with the character ruminating on her past, present, and future, their decision to go with narration to allow us to get glimpses of Anne's inner thoughts isn't completely unfounded. But by directly addressing the camera, she comes across as far too snide, spirited, and self-assured, which is the antithesis of her character. These fourth wall breaks also make Anne the audience's center of attention, when a crucial element of her story is that for the majority of her life she's been overlooked and kept to the sidelines, which is what made Wentworth's attention to her all the more significant. These fourth wall breaks are also so frequent that the novelty wears off fairly quickly, and by the end of the film it's outright annoying, which effectively ruins one of the most important and heartfelt moments of the entire film, with Anne's recitation of Wentworth's letter coming across as performative. Instead of having her deliver all of this exposition and emotion to camera, I think a more pensive narration, perhaps under the framework of a diary or letter, would have been a far better choice. In its attempt to ingratiate itself to modern viewers, the film inserts multiple gags that are mainstays of the rom-com genre, like the character chugging wine, hiding from her ex-boyfriend, crying in the bath, and peeing in the woods.
Now I'm single and thriving. Perfect.
It's such an obvious attempt at #relatable millennial humor that I was surprised that there wasn't a needlepoint with the phrase, "It's wine o'clock," hanging in Anne's bedroom. These cliché additions turn the downtrodden and dejected Anne into the bitter, jilted ex we've seen a dozen times before, just in Regency-inspired clothing. Sure, these moments are somewhat funny, but they're ill-suited for the themes of the story and the character. And I don't even know where else to mention this, but what was with the unexplained rabbit that she carried around everywhere? If the film doesn't take itself seriously, why would it expect its audience to? It's obvious that the filmmakers were attempting to make the story and characters more palatable, but in doing so it implies that the story isn't relatable as is, which couldn't be further from the truth. The very reason Jane Austen's novels continue to be relevant after so many years is that despite taking place in such a distant time period, the themes and characters remain relevant. And I don't see why, in order for something to be relatable to modern audiences, it has to be sassy and quirky. Overall, the tone of the film feels like a poor fit for the subject matter, and I personally think that the modern language, rom-com cliches, and fourth wall breaks would have been far more appropriate for an adaptation of Northanger Abbey, which has a young protagonist with an overactive imagination, a main character complex, and a sarcastic sense of humor. One thing that's important to mention in my criticism of the film's lighthearted tone is that while Persuasion is a great Jane Austen novel, it doesn't have my favorite adaptations. The novel's depressing tone is depressing, which can often result in a painfully slow viewing experience if you're adapting it word for word. That isn't to say that there isn't any humor. After all, that's a staple of Austen's writing, but it's far less obvious than it is in her other work. Although Anne is very doom and gloom early on, this is juxtaposed by the other characters' foolishness and ridiculousness, which is an element I think all adaptations of Persuasion should focus on and play up. Compared to everyone else in the novel, Anne is mature, serious, and reserved, which is part of the reason she and Wentworth get on so well. So in order to highlight that aspect of her character, you have to play her straight, almost a Debbie Downer at the beginning. But to breathe some life into the story and prevent it from being too morose, everyone else can serve as comic relief, which would also highlight how Anne is treated as an outsider by the others.
Shame there wasn't anything nice we could think to add about you, Anne.
Thanks for trying.
I wanted to leave you out entirely, but Daddy thought people might think you had died.
How are you feeling, Mary?
You haven't even asked me how I'm feeling.
I just did.
I'm so close to death, I can feel my organs decomposing.
By having the tone of the film start off more seriously, it would also highlight the character's evolution over the course of the story, transitioning from a wilting wallflower to a rose in bloom. Just as I'm not a purist when it comes to staying completely faithful to the source material, I'm similarly not a stickler for historical accuracy, especially when said accuracy is irrelevant to the actual plot. As such, I think colorblind casting in the world of Jane Austen is more than appropriate, and I commend the film for casting multiple people of color in supporting roles, even if it isn't as diverse as 2022's Mr. Malcolm's List, which is receiving far less praise. I will say that I think it was a missed opportunity to not cast a person of color for Wentworth, as it would have added another layer to Anne's traditionalist family's disapproval of him that modern audiences would easily understand. Multiple period films have gone the diverse approach in recent years, which regularly upsets people of a certain skin color, something that I think is incredibly obtuse considering these are works of fiction that are primarily about romance, and making the characters Asian or Black has absolutely no effect on that aspect of the plot. Being insistent upon historical accuracy to that extent means that you're more comfortable seeing people of color being mistreated on film, or never seeing them at all, instead of simply suspending your disbelief for an hour and a half. Disregarding the dozens of all-white adaptations of Jane Austen's work there have been in the past, Persuasion already has all-white films from both 1995 and 2007. A third adaptation that has a touch more melanin is not the end of the world. And in regard to this specific film, there are way bigger fish to fry. We briefly touched upon the film's complete disregard for the novel's characters earlier, but let's take a closer look at them. Starting with Anne Elliot, a woman who finds herself at odds with those around her, a common thread in Jane Austen's novels. Like most of Austen's heroines, Anne is clever and considerate, but where she differs from the others is her practicality, sensibility, and patience, which she uses to conceal her deep feelings of regret, melancholy, anxiety, and resignation. Anne is both idealistic and realistic, a contradiction that leads her to ruminating about the past decisions that have led her to where she is today, and this self-examination is what gives her the eventual opportunity to grow. As such, she's often described as the most mature of the bunch, with Austen once referring to her as, quote, a heroine who is almost too good for me. Unfortunately, the Anne Elliot in this film is no such person. Instead, she seems to be an amalgamation of Austen's more recognizable characters, specifically Elizabeth Bennet and Emma Woodhouse, with Anne bantering, mocking, and flirting her way through the film.
I think I'm in your way.
Perhaps you can correct that. You'd honestly rather prevent Mrs. Clay from taking my father's arm than talk with me.
Look at me, I'm Captain Wentworth and I am very impressive. I'm rich and I'm handsome and everybody loves me.
Will I see you again?
We must entrust that to Providence. That means I haven't yet made up my mind. Cousin is a term most accurately applied to those within one's family tree, not those within one's family forest. Imagine my luck, a flirt and a hard worker.
Oh, don't forget rich.
Lucky we have you to remind us.
Elizabeth and Emma are able to be more happy-go-lucky and bold for the simple reason that they're young. There's still time for their circumstances to change, but at 27, Anne Elliot has no hope for her dismal future. With the film depicting her in such a playful manner, the audience isn't able to comprehend how heavily this issue weighs on her mind, and why she dwells on her past relationship with Wentworth to the extent that she does, thereby destroying the hope and agony that was so crucial to the novel. At one point in the film, she even refers to herself as a ghost, when in fact, she appears to be full of life.
I'm 27 years old. I've no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents. And I'm frightened.
The character's unhappiness also plays out in a very different way than her book counterpart, acting as a crazed ex-girlfriend instead of someone who is suffering in silence. This change in temperament is exemplified in the film when she drunkenly reveals to an entire dinner party that her sister's husband Charles had proposed to her first, something she does out of jealousy when she sees Wentworth with Louisa. This blatant disregard for proper etiquette and wild display of emotion would absolutely astound the real Anne Elliot. In the film's attempt to highlight Anne's intelligence, they have her make quips about subjects like the Trojan War, Beethoven, and Macbeth, which go largely misunderstood by other characters, framing her as the clever one and they as stupid. In the novel, the side characters are indeed depicted as foolish, but Anne was never the witty, opinionated type. She was more of a quiet observer whose talents went unappreciated by others. While she is incredibly frustrated with her circumstances, she would never dream of placing the blame on others, as she is first and foremost upset at her own complacency and rues her own feebleness of character. In the film, however, she takes almost no responsibility for her actions and acts bitterly towards anyone she feels has remotely slighted her, which has the adverse effect of making her look like the bad guy instead of them. She regularly moans and groans about the coolness Wentworth displays towards her.
Love me, you idiot! Love me, kill me now, I can't bear it.
This is a complete misrepresentation of how the character perceives Wentworth upon his return. She does want him to love her again, but she also acknowledges that his behavior is justified based on her past rejection of him, and she would by no means think he were an idiot for distancing himself from her. Many of the side characters are depicted in a more positive manner, when in the novel, a large part of the story is that nearly everyone is absolutely awful. Lady Russell's motherly attributes are played up, with her reason for pushing Anne away from marriage being out of worry, when in the novel you could argue that her frequent interference of Anne's happiness seems slightly vindictive. With their frequent banter, Mary and Anne seem to have a friendlier relationship than they did in the novel, when they should really be at complete odds with one another. The most obvious change is with Louisa Musgrove, who is the most likable person in the film, perhaps because actress Nicole is so dang charming. She still has the youthful zeal of her novel counterpart, but this is no longer depicted in a negative light, and she often comes across as more mature than the film's petulant Anne.
I won't have you speak ill of Anne. She's too dear to me. I don't know what happened between you, and I'm not asking. I do see the best in her, and I implore you to look for it too.
In general, I think that the side characters are more interesting than the protagonist, with Mia McKenna-Bruce doing an excellent job with Anne's self-absorbed and emotional sister, Mary, although with her modern lines like,
"The thing about me is, I am an empath."
She feels incredibly out of place for the 1810s. While he isn't around for much of the film, I also loved Richard E. Grant as Anne's father, with the character reminding me somewhat of Bill Nye's turn as Mr. Woodhouse in 2020's Emma, albeit with his own quirks that make him far less likable.
What good is a title if you have to earn it? What good is anything if you have to earn it?
And as mentioned, I love Nia Towley as Louisa Musgrove, even if the characterization was different from the novel. Cast her in everything. The reason so many side characters come across in a better light than they did in the novel is because of the film's mischaracterization of Anne. In the novel, if her family wasn't ignoring her, they were belittling her, with Anne often taking these criticisms to heart, something this winking, wine-guzzling version of Anne would never dream of doing.
I'm so happy to see you.
What do you mean by that?
Mr. Elliot is on his way, and I want him to see what I look like next to you.
It's good to be home. But what's the advantage of being seen with them?
Anne, don't be deliberately dense.
Because this version of the character is more outspoken, regularly making jokes at others' expense and rolling her eyes at their behavior, there's less of an imbalance of power and she appears to have more agency. A key element of the novel is internal conflict, with multiple characters, not just Anne, having their own struggles and regrets that are allowed to play out over the course of the story. In the film, however, all of these issues are dealt with early on, with Lady Russell instantly apologizing for her part in Anne's unhappiness, Anne immediately recognizing that her life would have been better if she'd married Wentworth, and Mr. Elliot making his insincerity immediately apparent. As such, it leaves us with only one important storyline, the romance, which unfortunately falls flat. While in the novel, Anne waxes poetic about their relationship, talking about all the ways they understand one another and how impressive he is, in the film we never get the feeling that their love was all that great. Firstly, this version of Wentworth is unbelievably boring, lacking the heroism, poise, and charm of his previous counterparts, and as such you can never understand why Anne was so crazy about him to begin with. All of Anne's canonical gloominess seems to have been transferred over to him, leaving him a lifeless husk of a man, and basically all he does in the film is stare at Anne and then attempt to cover it up by talking shit about her to others. This loses all of the nuance of the original character, who struggles to reconcile his bitterness towards Anne and his continued love for her, all of which he attempts to hide from others for the sake of propriety. Secondly, when Anne speaks about their relationship, it comes across as nothing more than the delusional mutterings of a girl who thought she was in an exclusive relationship when the guy was still swiping on Tinder. With this version of Anne being so unlikable and this version of Wentworth so uninteresting, we're never able to get invested in their relationship, which is literally the point of the entire film. Not to mention their chemistry is severely lacking, to the point that I found myself more interested in Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay, even if their hot and heavy romance departs from the novel. Honestly, if you had Henry Golding, why would you not cast him as the male romantic lead? That man could have chemistry with a rock. Another problem with Anne and Wentworth's relationship in the film is how they act around each other. An important part of the novel is how no one is aware of their prior relationship, with the two doing their best to come across as nothing more than acquaintances when they're reunited. The novel features obvious pining, longing, and yearning, but the film ruins any of this tension by making the characters comically awkward around one another and obvious that they know each other, and it's so bad that multiple side characters point it out, because they'd literally have to be blind to not notice it. The problem with this is that it makes it far too obvious that both characters still harbor feelings for one another, losing any of the nail-biting will they, won't they that's present in the novel.
You want to know a secret?
Always.
My most grim moments at sea, and I felt completely lost and confused and inadequate. I would ask myself, what would Anne do here?
Overall, the vast majority of characters are almost nothing like their book counterparts, but for some, that makes them more interesting. Unfortunately, that isn't the case for our two leads, and the deviation from the source material makes for an incredibly generic romance that I cared little about. When it comes to period dramas, I'm of the firm opinion that if they're not going to have a good story, then they should at least have the decency to look good, or vice versa. And unfortunately, the 2022 Persuasion lacks in both departments. The clothing is generically Regency, featuring the pelisses, empire waistlines, cap sleeves, and tall collars that define the era, but without any of the creativity or panache. Compared to the Rococo period or the Gilded Age, clothing from the Regency era might not be as glaringly ostentatious, but that doesn't mean everyone should look like they're wearing gunny sacks. In the film's desperate attempt to be broadly appealing, they're unable to decide if they want the clothing to be accurate or anachronistic, and this lack of confidence results in a muddled aesthetic that is unable to stand out in a lineup of Austen adaptations, and its earthy tones regularly come across as a knockoff of 2005's Pride and Prejudice, which even with its historical inaccuracies is more visually appealing. And as much as I dislike the over-the-top costuming in Bridgerton, which often forgoes accuracy in favor of aesthetic, I can at least respect that the anachronisms serve a purpose. With so much Regency-era content coming out lately, it's important to create a distinctive aesthetic to help yours stand apart. For instance, think of 2012's Snow White and the Huntsman and Mirror Mirror. Despite featuring the same protagonist and sharing the same plot points, they're visually and thematically different, never allowing the audience to confuse one for the other. Persuasion does not succeed at this, which is largely due to the monotonous costuming. These incredibly simplistic and repetitive designs completely fail to showcase the unique style of the time period, something which is a huge shame considering how fun clothing in the Regency era could be, as evidenced by 2020's Emma. Now, before someone comments, Persuasion and Emma have totally different tones, so they shouldn't look the same. Trust me, I know. But the problem with the Persuasion film is that it's obviously trying to be Emma, but in story, character, and costuming, it doesn't come close. With its more somber storyline, it makes sense to give the film a more subdued color palette, but the ever-present shades of brown, green, black, and blue in the setting do absolutely nothing for the similarly colored clothing. During the Regency era, clothing dyed with natural substances were common, resulting in muted hues that would fade with time, and in this regard the color palette of the film makes sense. But because many of the designs are so similar, and every character winds up wearing these shades interchangeably, they all wind up blending together. Considering the film is comfortable putting Anne in black and gray, I would have made this more obvious and consistent, wearing only black at the very beginning, then lighter and lighter shades of gray as she rediscovers herself, then finally white when she and Wentworth reconcile. I also would have never put her in puce, as it would have been far too lavish. I would have kept that sort of symbolism throughout the film, dedicating specific colors to specific characters to help audiences easily identify them and infer certain things about their personalities. Perhaps yellow for Mary, Anne's emotional little sister, green for Elizabeth to highlight her vanity, and blue for Louisa to emphasize her youth. Lady Russell has a unique color palette for the film, often being spotted in bright jewel tones, which is believable from a historical perspective as she's wealthy enough to afford such colors. Her clothing is also made of more luxurious and expensive fabrics like silk, while the much poorer Elliots wear linen and cotton. Anne's elder sister Elizabeth wears the most intricate designs in the entire film, and is often spotted in gowns with elaborate trim and frilly decorations, which is a great choice for the character as she's meant to be vain and spoiled, and her clothing makes the difference between the two sisters' personalities and circumstances apparent at a quick glance. Without a doubt, she is my favorite costumes in the film, although some are more faithful to the time period than others. Anne often rewears her clothing, which makes sense for the character as she's older, unmarried, and poor, but it's for this very reason that the wardrobes of the other characters have to be exaggerated in order to highlight her unfortunate circumstances. The Musgrove sisters aren't wealthy either, but they're of marriageable age, and thus their family would be expected to dress them in a manner that could secure them a match, instead of the boring ensembles that look incredibly similar to Anne's. This would be especially crucial for Louisa, as she essentially becomes Anne's rival in love, and Anne has to see in the young girl everything that she isn't. In order to further highlight the difference between Anne and her peers, I would have changed the silhouette of everyone else's skirt to be more triangular, while leaving Anne's tubular. This would be a little off from the timeline of the novel, with the triangular shape becoming more popular at the end of the 1810s, but it would be a subtle indication to the audience that Anne didn't have the financial means to dress fashionably, as well as hold a symbolic meaning of showing how she was stuck in the past. The film does the bare minimum when it comes to Regency fashion etiquette by giving women long sleeves during the day and shorter sleeves for formal evening occasions, but there are an assortment of other inaccuracies that plague the film. As they are in many Regency films produced by Hollywood, bonnets are near abandoned, and when hats do make a rare appearance, they're bizarrely modern, like this beret that Anne wears that makes her look like she's about to audition for Newsies. Another missing element are gloves, which were worn during the day and night, and whose absence would have been considered improper during the time period. Because Anne was literally convinced by her family and friends to reject Wentworth due to societal expectations, it makes no sense for her character to blatantly ignore such things. The same is to be said for all of her vain and prideful family members, who would never create an opportunity where their position might be called into question. Although at 32 Dakota Johnson is technically older than Anne Elliot, the character's bleak circumstances as a spinster aren't able to translate on screen because of how glamorous she looks. During the Regency period, a woman of 27 would be considered past her prime. Hollywood is absolutely terrified of women looking old or imperfect, and as a result, this version of Anne Elliot has gorgeous flowing locks, Pinterest-worthy makeup, and dresses like an ad for Anthropologie. The actresses in the 1995 and 2007 adaptations of Persuasion were of a similar age to Dakota, but were costumed in a way that helped them appear older, allowing for their worries about love and general unhappiness to easily translate to contemporary audiences. In the case of the 1995 version, one of the most historically accurate Austen adaptations, Anne's appearance is purposely made to look more lived in, with the actress wearing no makeup early on in the film to highlight the character's depressed state. And it's only after she begins to find happiness again that she is able to blossom, dressing more colorfully and overall looking more polished. This symbolism is non-existent in the 2022 version. Not only does Anne look far too put together for a woman who has been miserable for the better part of a decade, but there's no attempt to make Dakota Johnson look like a woman who could believably exist in the 1800s. With the side bangs and beachy waves, she looks like a time traveler, and I found myself reminded of that one tweet that says, "Some people can't be believably cast in a period piece. Like, sorry Jessica Biel, you have a face that knows about text messaging." And I think that's exactly the case with Dakota Johnson. She might work in the 1960s or 70s, but 1815? I don't think so. There's a clear attempt to dress the character in an androgynous style, with Anne wearing a top hat, men's shirts, and even men's underwear. Obviously, this was a conscious decision, as the other characters in the film don't suffer from nearly as many anachronistic styling decisions, but it simply doesn't make sense from a character standpoint. This costuming choice is somewhat reminiscent of Jo March in 2019's Little Women, who wears Laurie's waistcoats and generally has more boyish styling than her sisters, but in that case it makes sense for the character as she rebels against traditional femininity. As we've mentioned, Anne Elliot isn't a rule breaker and she isn't easygoing, and this choice in costuming further highlights how deeply this production misunderstood the point of the novel. What's perhaps most disappointing about this turn of events is that there was a more traditional take on the story in production back in 2020, which was going to star Sarah Snook and Joel Fry, but the project was shelved following the announcement of Netflix's adaptation months later, with the actress saying in an interview, quote, "The short story is that Netflix decided to greenlight their own, so Fox abandoned the one we were doing." Considering how lackluster this film wound up being, I wish they'd consider putting the other version back into production. One thing that's to be noted about my personal dislike for this adaptation is that it follows in a long-standing tradition of negative opinions of adaptations of Austen's work. If you thought Marvel fans were scary, you should see some of the think pieces Jay-Knights have written. Take for instance 2005's Pride and Prejudice, which came out after the period of Austen mania in the 1990s. While it's beloved today, at the time of its release, fans of Austen's work hated it for its deviation from the source material and historical inaccuracies, with the New Yorker saying about the film, quote, "Any resemblance to scenes and characters created by Miss Austen is of course entirely coincidental." Nowadays you'll find that most people consider it the superior adaptation, even if it doesn't have Colin Firth stripping. All that is to say that hardcore fans of any work will always find something wrong, as there's no possible way for anyone to live up to what they've dreamed of in their heads. Keeping that in mind, regardless of my opinion on the film, if you wound up enjoying it and it's what inspires you to explore more of Jane Austen's work, then that's all that matters. I won't deny that there are moments in the film that are charming, and if you're someone who isn't at all familiar with the source material, then you likely won't be able to see anything glaringly wrong with the adaptation. Just keep in mind that the film and the novel are two very different things. Traditional adaptations of Jane Austen's work are a dime a dozen at this point, and I'm totally open to change. The problem with Persuasion is that the way they chose to modernize it was all wrong. So, to answer the question I asked at the very beginning of this video, yes, it is the worst Jane Austen adaptation, but if you completely divorce it from the source material, then it's watchable. What did you think of Netflix's Persuasion? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!